Let's look at a game in the Nimzo-Indian Defense which begins d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. Okay, this game proceeded e3, b6, bishop d3 to protect the e4 square, and bishop to b7 also to influence e4. And this is called the St. Petersburg variation. We did a video on this and other variations. I'll put a link in the description below. Okay, the game proceeded knight f3 to guard the g2 pawn. Knight e4, black occupies the e4 square to stop white from pushing his pawn to e4. And now an interesting pawn sacrifice, castles. In our last video we looked at the move queen to c2 to protect the c3 knight. But white sacrifices a pawn on c3, and black doesn't take it. He prefers to just bolster the e4 point. Let's see what might have happened if black took the pawn. So you could play knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop takes c3, hitting the rook in the corner, rook b1, d6, getting ready to develop the queen's knight, queen c2 attacking the bishop, bishop a5. That might have been a continuation, and white has excellent compensation for his pawn. He's got more space, better pieces. This bishop is sidelined on a5. Okay, so back to the game. After castles, black didn't take the pawn. He played f5. And then d5. There's a lot of consequences, this move. First of all, it's blocking the bishop from influencing e4. It's opening up a square for the white knight to land on d4, but it also has the drawback of giving away the c5 square. Black can post a knight on c5, either this one or the other knight on c5. All right, black proceeds, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and now knight a6, heading for that c5 square potentially. Notice black could have won a pawn in this position. For example, e takes d5, c takes d5, knight takes c3, but then queen c2 attacking the knight, knight takes d5, bishop takes f5, and again white has excellent compensation for the pawn. The board is wide open for white's bishop pair, and his dark squared bishop is coming to this diagonal. Okay, so back to the game. Black played knight a6, knight d4, taking advantage of that d4 square, attacking the e6 pawn for a second time. So knight e c5 to guard that pawn. Bishop c2, saving the bishop pair. Castles. f3, supporting the e4 pawn push. Queen f6, which puts some pressure on the c3 pawn. If this knight on d4 moves, the c3 pawn is lost. Bishop d2 to protect c3. g6. e4 expanding in the center as planned. e5 to stop any further expansion, attacking the knight which retreats. And then f4 is an excellent move. So black takes the opportunity to lock up the pawn structure, making the bishop pair less effective. In a blocked pawn structure like this, knights are actually superior to bishops. Also, we have the pawns slanting toward the king side here, pointing in this direction. So black can attack on the king side by making a pawn break with the g-pawn. So rook f2, g5, here comes the pawn. So it's threatening to go to g4 and then play g takes f3, and then once white recaptures with his g-pawn, the G file will be open. So that's the plan. So the king gets off of the G file. Rook F7 plans to put the rook on G7. Queen to F1 for defensive purposes. D6 further locks up the pawn structure. G3. So white is attacking the F4 pawn and maybe wants to open the G file himself. Bishop C8. Notice white can't really play for a locked pawn position to give himself some safety for his king, because if he plays G4 at any point, black can play H5 and pry open the H file instead of the G file. So bishop C8, G takes F4, G takes F4, rook to G2 check, king to H8. Now since these pawns are pointed in the king side direction and this bishop is nicely placed, it's actually black that makes better use of the open G file. Queen to F2, vacating the back rank, maybe intending to double rooks, but black gives white no time to do so, plays another excellent move, bishop to H3. There's nowhere for the rook to go but back, so there's no doubling of rooks. Knight B7. Okay, he's planning on moving the knight to A5 potentially and attacking that weak C4 pawn. C4 is often a weakness in the Nimzo when the pawns get doubled, and sometimes black can attack it and win that pawn. So the pawn structure is closed off, everything's under control, so black has switched plans. He's playing on both sides of the board. And at this point, white gets a little frustrated. He doesn't have any scope for his bishops, so he pushes C5, sacrifices a pawn, hoping to open up some diagonals for his bishops. The knight takes the pawn, C4, knight D7, transferring the knight over to the queen side, or king side rather. Rook A, E1, knight F8, knight C1, knight G6. So this knight's been busy, and it posts itself on G6 for a very important reason you'll see. Knight D3, rook G8, bishop D1, trying to get this bishop into the game. Rook F G7. Now we see the purpose of the knight maneuver all the way to the G6 square. Black really wanted to double rooks on the G file, but couldn't do it without white exchanging the rooks. But behind the knight, the rooks can be doubled. Bishop to E2, knight to H4, and now black has good control over the G2 square, which is important. Rook takes G7, rook takes G7, bishop to F1. Since black has such strong control over G2, white really cannot oppose the black rook by playing rook to G1. Black would have rook takes G1 check, and then two moves. If queen takes G1, then bishop to G2 check forces the queen to sacrifice itself, and black wins. If king takes G1 instead, black has queen to G6 check, king H1, bishop to G2 check, king G1, knight takes F3 check, and the king has no moves. So bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, discovered check, king to F1, and queen takes E4, protecting the bishop, and black is infiltrating in this position and is up 3 pawns. So again, a one position for black. Okay, so in this position, white played bishop to F1 to challenge the bishop on H3. Then bishop G2 check, bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, queen takes knight. So white sacrifices the queen because the only other move is queen to F1, giving up the bishop on D2. So white didn't want to play a piece down. So instead, queen takes knight, queen takes queen, king takes rook. And so if you look at the material, we have a queen, black has a queen for a rook and a bishop. Okay. Queen to g5 check, king h1, queen h5, king g2, knight d8, the knight comes into the game, knight f2, knight f7, knight h3, knight g5. White really doesn't want to exchange pieces in this position, knight g1, queen to e8, and white resigned. Okay, the queen was headed for the a4 square. It can fork these pawns, and white had enough. All right, thanks for watching the game.